In this video, I'll be going over how to simplify fractions. There are 3 steps when it comes to simplifying fractions. First step is to have a factor list for both numerator and the denominator. Secondly, find the greatest common factor. And lastly, divide by the greatest common factor. Here is an example, 10 over 14. So the first step is to find the factor list. So we'll take 10 and 14, and then we'll find a sequence of numbers which can multiply into 10. So for 10, we can see 1 times 10 is 10, 2 times 5 is 10, and then 3 doesn't work, 4 doesn't work, 5 times 2 is 10, 6 doesn't work, 7 doesn't work, 8 doesn't work, 9 doesn't work, and finally 10. For 14, we have 1 times 14 is 14, and then 2 times 7 is 14, and 3 doesn't work, 4 doesn't work, 5 doesn't work, 6 doesn't work, 7 times 2 is 14, 8 doesn't work, 9 doesn't work, 10 doesn't work, 11 doesn't work, 12 doesn't work, 13 doesn't work, and then we have 14. So the next step would then be to find the greatest common factor from the factor list. So the biggest number that we can find from both numbers is 2. So therefore, when we are simplifying this fraction, we are dividing it by the greatest common factor, both the numerator and the denominator. So since we found 2 was the greatest common factor, so we're dividing the 10 by 2, and we're dividing the 14 by 2. And then 10 divided by 2, we have 5, and then 14 divided by 2 is 7. And how do we know when we can no longer simplify anymore? Whenever you reach to a point where the greatest common factor is 1, that's when you know you can no longer simplify further. So in this case, since we are at 5 over 7, we could look at 5 and 7. You can see 1 times 5 is 5. 2 doesn't work, 3 doesn't work, 4 doesn't work, then we have 5. For 7, we have 1, so 1 times 7, and then 2 doesn't work, 3 doesn't work, 4 doesn't work, 5 doesn't work, 6 doesn't work, then we have 7. So in this case, the greatest common factor was 1, and that's how you know this is the final answer. Now what about this one? To find the factor list, we're going to do it again. So placing 9 and 27 on the bottom and trying to find the greatest common factor. So 9, we have 1 times 9, and then 3 times 3 is 9. The next one will be 9. So that's all we have for 9. For 27, again we have 1 times 27, and then we have 3 times 9 is 27, and then we have 9 times 3 is 27. And then the last one will be 27 times 1 is 27. So the greatest common factor here is 9. So we'll divide the numerator and the denominator by 9 here, and we'll see that this resulted in 1 over 3. And to check on the answer, making sure that we've done everything correctly, we'll look at 1 and 3. 1 can only be 1. 3, 1 times 3 is 3, and then we have 3. We see the common denominator being 1, so we know the answer. So we know this is the answer. Here's another question. 20 over 60. We're gonna go through the same process. First, finding the factor list. Okay, so we can see 1 will work, 2 will work, 4 times 5 is 20, 5 times 4 is 20, 10 times 2 is 20, and then 20 times 1 is 20. For 60, 1, 2 times 30 is 60, 4 times 15 is 60, 5 times 12 is 60, 10 times 6 is 60, 12 times 5 is 60, 15 times 4 is 60, 20 times 3 is 60, 30 times 2 is 60, and then we have 60. So from here, we're going to find the greatest common factor. For 20, this is the greatest common factor for both numbers. So we're going to go ahead and divide both numerator and the denominator by 20. And we'll get 1 over 3. And lastly, again, just making sure this is, you can no longer further simplify. We're taking 1, so we know there's only 1, and 3 is 1 and 3. So only 1 can go into it, which means 1/3 is our answer. Now there is also another way that you can do this question. Especially when you have larger numbers, is that you could, as long as you can think of a number where both the numerator and denominator can divide into, you could simplify multiple times. So for example, 20 and 60, we know that they're both even numbers, so we can definitely divide both by 2. And we'll see that the numerator would become 10 and the denominator would become 30. And then we look at the number again, they're still both even numbers, so let's divide by 2 again. Now that will become 5 and the denominator will be 15. Now that we see 5 and 15, we know both can go into 5, so we'll divide 5 for both. And answer is 1/3. Now can it divide any further? We can see the only way you can do it is by 1. And so therefore, this would be the answer. Here's another question. 14 divided by 49. For finding the factor list, 1, 2, and 7. For 49, 1, 7, and 49. Greatest common factor is 7. Dividing by 7, 2 and 7. And then final check, 1 and 2, 1 and 7. So that's the answer. So these 4 are examples of how you would simplify fractions. We also have other fraction tutorials in the comment section, so feel free to check them out. And thank you for watching.